I found his wedding ring in the trash, tucked into a crumpled napkin beneath a banana peel and the evening's crossword. The faint soap sheen still clinging to the gold as if it had washed its hands of me. And for a long, hovering moment, I stood absolutely still, with the lid pressing against my stomach and the thin smell of citrus cleanser rising from the plastic liner, thinking that perhaps my old eyes had finally begun to betray me. That perhaps this was a look-alike, a tourist ring from a boardwalk vendor, a gag, a mistake, anything but the quiet, deliberate truth that lay gleaming among the pulp and the ink. He wore it for 40 years, or so I thought, and then some ordinary Wednesday, he dropped it like a receipt into the bin and walked away from the sink, humming a little tune I hadn't heard since our son was 10, and thought whistling could ward off storms. I am 81, the kind of 81 that remembers how drawers used to stick in summer, and how coffee percolators sounded like they were trying to learn to talk. The kind of 81 that knows there are two kinds of silence in a home, one that tenderly makes room for rest, and one that spreads out like fog and steals names. And I live now in a narrow one-bedroom with a balcony that faces a park, where the maple leaves pour their green into my mornings, and children scrape their scooters against the path in bright, unself-conscious arcs. And on the counter beside the sugar jar is a small velvet box that used to hold a brooch my sister gave me. And in that box lies the ring. Not because I cherish it as I once did, but because I have learned that proof is a kind of mercy for a woman who has spent her life doubting whether the ache she felt had a shape that others would recognize. I did not cry when I found it, though I can tell you precisely how. The light looked falling across the tiles, a pale lake of afternoon wobbling under the window screen, and I can tell you that the garbage lid made a muffled sound like a yawn when I let it go and steadied myself on the counter. And I can tell you that the knife I had used to split an orange was still on the board, leaving a tiny crescent of zest on the wood. One of those useless, decorative remnants that nevertheless smells like a memory if you press it to your nose. And I can tell you, too, that in the half-second before I lifted the napkin, I heard Gerald clearing his throat in the bedroom, the habitual prelude he used before speaking, a clearing that always meant he was about to say something practical and well-considered and utterly unremarkable. And for reasons I couldn't name, I folded the napkin closed as if it were a secret bird I needed to carry. And I slipped out to the balcony without my cardigan and stood in the thin March wind with my palm cupped, watching a boy in a blue jacket try to free his kite from a low branch. And in that posture, with the ring's cold weight seeping through the paper into the lines of my hand, I realized that beginnings often hide at the ends of things, and that the first truth of a long marriage is not that you have stayed, but that you have stayed awake enough to notice when the staying has changed its shape. If you are reading this expecting the tidy logic of betrayal, the lipstick on the collar, or the late-night text with a name you do not recognize, I will disappoint you, because the violence I am describing is quiet and domestic and almost polite. It is the sort of moral weather that wears down the railing until your hand slides where it used to grip, the sort that prefers plausible explanations and the word misunderstanding. And if you had asked me even the week before whether Gerald might slip his ring into the trash, I would have laughed the way old women laugh when they are trying to be charitable, air through teeth and a flutter of the wrist. Because for years I believed our story was ordinary in the best possible way. Two people moving steadily through the decades like boats tethered to the same pier, bobbing in separate currents now and then, but tied, always tied, by something we did not have to name. And yet, when I turned from the balcony and saw him framed in the hallway, his hair thinner than last year, and his shoulders slightly folded as if someone had tucked him into himself, and he said, "What are you doing out there without a sweater, Maribel?" With that careful tone he had adopted lately, the one that pretended concern while measuring distance, I felt a little hinge in my chest slip, and I knew that the napkin in my hand was not just paper. It was a curtain being pulled back on a stage I had decorated for decades without noticing that the audience had left. I have been many women in this home. The cook who learns the pan's moods, the nurse who counts out pills with a thumbnail, the archivist who knows which box holds fourth-grade drawings and which holds the last letter my father wrote from the plant. I have been the one who remembers our first apartment with the crooked radiator and the way he used to place his ring on the soap dish before stepping into the shower because he said the metal made his finger itch when the water was too hot. And I have been the one who told myself that the small omissions were kindnesses. He forgot our anniversary because his back hurt. He let the soup burn because the news was bad. He didn't reach for my hand because his mind was elsewhere. And whose mind isn't elsewhere sometimes when the world keeps inventing reasons to drift. But there is a difference between a lapse and a leaving, and a ring in the trash is a grammar you do not misread. I stood there with my foolish little bird of paper and metal, and he stood there with his practiced cough, and I said that the wind felt good, and he said that the forecast promised rain, which is how older couples talk about weather when they cannot name the storm inside. And then he asked if I had seen the crossword, because he swore he had not finished it, and it would bother him, he said, to let Friday roll over Saturday with a half-filled grid. And I said nothing about the smudged clues wilting under a banana peel, because in that instant I understood that I needed space inside my head to hear the real sound of this moment, not his practiced rustle of polite routines. And so I nodded, and he turned back to the bedroom to arrange his socks by length as he liked to do when he was unsettled. And I went to the sink and rinsed the ring under the thin, juddering stream, and I watched the pulp slide off and the gold reassert itself with a shine that felt almost smug. And then I dried it on the hem of my blouse because all the good dish towels were in the wash, and I placed it in the velvet box and set the box beside the sugar jar like a new habit I was daring into existence. And I leaned my hip against the counter, the way women do when they are mustering a decision. And I thought about the other time, years ago, when I found my mother's letter, torn and folded, into a grocery bag, because Gerald had cleaned the drawer and didn't know, he said, what that scrap meant. And about how I told myself then that a man can be taught the museum of someone else's life, that you can walk him through the halls and explain why this ticket stub matters and why this hospital bracelet is a reliquary instead of trash, and how I believed I had done it, that I had made him careful with what I carried, and how marriage is sometimes the art of believing your own lesson plan has taken until the exam comes in the form of a crumpled napkin and a ring. I suppose this is where I should tell you who I am in a way that answers a reader's shy curiosity. So I will give you what I have. I am the woman on the second bus when the first one is too crowded. The woman who knows the names of the store clerks but never asks for a discount. The woman who keeps a spare 20 in the back of her checkbook because there is always a nephew or a neighbor who suddenly discovers an emergency that requires a sheet cake or a taxi. I am the grandmother who bakes without recipes because the hand learns what the heart repeats. The mother who forgave too many times because I thought forgiveness was a light you kept on for stragglers. the wife who did not keep score because I believed the point of the game was to keep playing. And I am also the woman who has woken at 3 in the morning more times than I can count to that special brand of nocturnal panic that smells like tin and feels like falling, and who has learned very recently to breathe through it by naming out loud the objects on her nightstand: clock, water glass, lip balm, book, until the room returns to its proper size. I tell you all this because the ring is not interesting unless you understand the fingers that wore it, and my fingers are not interesting unless you understand the work they did and the work they were denied. Because a story like this, told by a woman my age, is often tidied by others into a parable about miscommunication or the slow drift of hearts. And I need you to know that I did not drift. I held the rope even when it burned, and if there is a moral, it will not be one you can embroider on a pillow without seeing the scorch marks. When I set the velvet box down and heard the soft thud against the laminate, it sounded to me like a door closing 2 rooms away, one of those interior doors that has swelled a bit in the humidity and only shuts if you mean it. And I thought then, with an almost girlish clarity I had not felt since I was 20 and cut my hair in a bathroom mirror without asking permission, that I was not afraid. Not of the confrontation, not of the bookkeeping, not of the sudden emptiness that would come if he asked me, in that tired, careful voice, to make allowances for the wear and tear of years. I was afraid only of losing the courage to say what this was, and so I kept my mouth closed for the rest of that evening, and made us a simple supper, and placed his plate on the table without comment, and watched him eat with his eyes on the news, unringed, untroubled. A man in a shirt I had ironed, a man whose right hand looked oddly naked to me in a way that made me think of winter branches, and when he rinsed his dish and thanked me like a guest and went to sort the socks again, I opened the box one more time, just to be certain I hadn't dreamed it. And then I went to bed without the nightstand lit and slept without dreams. And in the morning, when the sun made its slow, honeyed climb over the park and poured itself across my kitchen floor, I wrote the first sentence of this story in my head and let it sit there like a warm stone. I found his wedding ring in the trash, and there are women my age who will understand that sometimes the things that get thrown away are the final words of a long conversation the other person refused to have. When I asked him about it, I made sure my voice didn't tremble, because by then I had already learned that a trembling voice gives men permission to talk to you as though you are a patient instead of a witness. I waited until he finished reading the paper, until he folded it with that practiced care of his, the way someone closes a conversation without words, and I said, as evenly as if I were asking about the weather, "Gerald, why was your wedding ring in the trash?" He looked up, startled but not frightened, the way a man looks when a child has interrupted his nap. "What?" he said, dragging the syllable out until it was more sigh than question. "Your ring," I repeated. "I found it this morning." He blinked twice, adjusted his glasses, glanced toward the sink, and then back at me with that infuriating calm that had once made me feel safe and now felt like a lid being pressed down over a pot about to boil. "Oh," he said finally, "I must have knocked it in when I was cleaning the drawer." He even smiled, a small, apologetic curve of his mouth that had fooled me for half a century. "I'll get it," he added, as if the act of retrieval could rewind time, as if his hand in the trash would be enough to mend the rip between us. But he didn't move. He just sat there, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee mug, and I realized He wasn't planning to get it at all. He was hoping I would. That I'd shrug and let the matter dissolve into the clutter of small domestic accidents we'd accumulated over the years. I could have. God knows I had before. When he forgot my birthday 2 years in a row, when he accidentally threw out the photograph of my mother holding me as an infant, when he stopped saying goodnight, when he began calling me Han in that tone that made the word sound like an error instead of affection. But that morning, standing in my kitchen with sunlight trembling on the counter and the smell of coffee turning bitter on the stove, something in me refused to fold back into obedience. "You didn't knock it in," I said quietly, and he froze just enough for me to see the truth flash across his face like a brief storm over still water. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was relief. The kind that comes when a secret finally stops being heavy. "It's not a big deal," he murmured, looking past me toward the window where the sparrows were fighting over the feeder. "The ring's just a thing, Maribel. 40 years of wearing it. It gets in the way sometimes. My finger swells. It doesn't mean anything." I wanted to laugh because I could feel the absurdity pressing at my ribs, the wild comedy of a man deciding, after 4 decades, that the symbol of his devotion was now a matter of physical inconvenience. But I didn't laugh. I just watched him as though seeing him for the first time without the lens of habit. There he was, the man who used to write my name on lunch bags, who once built a bookshelf from old planks because I said I missed the smell of wood, the man who held my hand through labor and funerals and the slow withering of youth. And there he was now, shrinking into the corner of the kitchen, defending the right to throw away a promise. He rose from his chair and walked toward the sink, rinsing his cup with mechanical precision. The ring-shaped indentation on his hand caught the light, a pale ghost of commitment, and I thought, absurdly, that it looked like a scar left by absence. "You're making too much of it," he said without turning around. "It's just a ring. We've been married 40 years. Isn't that proof enough?" I almost said yes. I almost surrendered because there is a reflex in women my age to smooth the air, to repair what men damage by calling it misunderstanding. But I couldn't. Not this time. "Proof of what?" I asked. He turned then, water dripping from his fingers, eyes narrowing not in anger but confusion, as if I had started speaking another language. "Proof that we're fine," he said. "That we've lasted. That we've done our job." Our job. The phrase hung in the air, cold and metallic. Marriage as employment, as a task performed with diligence but without affection. I looked at him, at the slope of his shoulders, at the thinning hair, at the hands that once trembled when they touched me. I wanted to say that longevity isn't love, that years can accumulate like dust, disguising neglect as endurance. But the words stayed lodged somewhere behind my teeth, heavy as coins. Instead, I said, "Then why did it end up in the trash?" He sighed. "Because it's old," he said simply. "Like everything else around here." He left the room after that, his slippers whispering against the tile, and I stood there with my heart beating in that slow, dangerous rhythm of someone realizing they've mistaken endurance for intimacy. The house was suddenly enormous. Every sound echoed. The fridge hum, the drip of the faucet, the faint shuffle of him moving down the hall. I picked up the napkin again, unwrapped the ring, and stared at it until my eyes blurred. The inscription inside, faint now, still read, G&M, forever. I pressed my thumb over it, and the word forever seemed to fade completely under the warmth of my skin, as if it had never been carved there at all. I thought of the day he'd given it to me. It was June, the year Nixon resigned, and we were young enough to think that love could survive anything, even politics. We'd married at the courthouse with 2 friends as witnesses. He'd bought the ring on credit, promising to replace it when he could afford better, but he never did. I used to think that was romantic, that he saw the perfection in imperfection. But now I understood that he simply didn't see me enough to notice the difference. That afternoon, I opened the old photo album he kept on the bookshelf, the one we hadn't touched in years. The plastic pages clung together from humidity. There we were, smiling on beaches, at picnics, holding children who were now middle-aged and too busy to call. I stared at my younger self, at that woman who thought she could build a fortress out of loyalty, and I wanted to warn her. Fortresses can also become prisons when only one person guards the gate. By evening, the house smelled like reheated soup. He ate silently at the table, spoons scraping against porcelain in slow, methodical circles. I couldn't bring myself to sit across from him, so I stood by the counter pretending to tidy. He didn't notice. When he finished, he said, "Don't fuss. It's fine," and disappeared into the den. The television came on, voices rising and falling in another room like ghosts rehearsing a script I no longer understood. I washed the dishes carefully, the ring resting on the windowsill where the last light touched it. I thought about throwing it back into the trash, deeper this time, so that the act would belong to me. Instead, I dried my hands and placed it in my apron pocket, feeling the cool circle press against my thigh with every step. That night, while he slept, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the ring before me, and I wrote a single sentence on the back of an envelope. He threw away the proof before I even asked the question. Then I tucked the paper inside the same velvet box. The next morning, he left early for his walk. He didn't kiss my cheek, didn't say goodbye. Just the sound of the door closing softly, as if he were trying not to wake a stranger. I sat on the edge of the bed, the sheets still warm where his body had been, and realized that I could not remember the last time we had touched without obligation. The absence had been growing for years, a slow corrosion disguised as calm, and now the evidence gleamed in my palm like something honest at last. When he returned, he brought me a paper cup of coffee from the corner shop, as though gestures could stand in for apology. "Thought you'd like one," he said. I took it, thanked him, and we talked about nothing. About the neighbor's new car, the weather, the news. But underneath every word, I could feel the hollow where the ring used to be. That was the moment, though I didn't yet understand it, when the end began. Not the explosive kind of ending with slammed doors and shouted confessions, but the quiet unraveling that starts with a truth left too long in the dark. The ring in the trash wasn't a mistake or even an insult. It was a message disguised as negligence, a declaration of vacancy. He had stopped being married long before that morning. I was just the last to be informed. I watched him sip his coffee and stare out the window at the street where children were chalking crooked suns on the pavement, and I realized that the only real mystery was why I had waited so long to notice. Somewhere inside me, something began to shift. Not loudly, but decisively, like a hinge that finally agrees to move after years of rust. I thought of the ring, of the decades it had circled his finger, and I thought, maybe the gold was softer than I imagined. Maybe it bent too easily under the weight of pretending. Later, when he dozed in his chair, I slipped out onto the balcony with my notebook and began to write. Not letters, not accusations. Just fragments of what I was beginning to remember about myself before all the silence began. I wrote until the light faded and the air grew cold, and when I came back inside, I placed the ring back in its box. It did not feel like mourning. It felt like inventory, like the first step in a long, necessary audit of what had been lost and what could still be reclaimed. The next weeks passed like an echo that refused to fade, every room in the house humming with that faint dissonance that follows a conversation unfinished, a melody missing its last note. And I began to notice things I had never bothered to see before, as though the absence of the ring had stripped away a thin film that once softened the edges of our life together. Gerald moved differently now, slower, yet with a kind of restless caution, the way a man walks through a museum filled with fragile relics that no longer belong to him. He started keeping to his study more often, closing the door halfway, not enough to claim privacy, but enough to make it clear that whatever happened beyond that threshold no longer required my witness. When I passed by, I could hear the faint hum of his old records, jazz from the years when we still thought life was something we could improvise through, and his low, murmuring voice on the phone. I told myself it was business calls, but even as I formed the excuse, I could feel the lie curdling on my tongue. He still spoke to me, of course, but his words had become administrative, transactions wrapped in pleasantry. We're low on milk. The neighbor asked about trimming the hedge. Did you move my blue sweater? Each sentence a receipt of coexistence, neatly printed, emotion-free. I answered in kind, nodding, performing my role in the quiet theater of habit. Yet every exchange left a residue of distance, an invisible film that thickened until the house itself seemed to exhale in boredom. Our dinners turned into synchronized routines, 2 plates, 2 glasses, 2 sets of eyes that met only in the reflection of the cutlery. Sometimes he would hum between bites, a low, tuneless vibration that made me want to scream, not from anger, but from the eerie normalcy of it, as if our marriage had become an art installation titled Endurance, curated by silence. One morning, while dusting the shelves, I found a book I didn't recognize tucked between our old travel guides. The Essential Divorce Handbook. The spine was creased, the pages slightly swollen from damp fingers. I stood there for a long time with the duster still in my hand, reading the title again and again until the words blurred into something meaningless. When he came home that afternoon, I placed the book on the kitchen table between us without accusation. He looked at it, then at me, and said only, "I picked it up for a friend." I nodded because what else was there to say? A friend. He had many, apparently, those shadow companions whose names changed with each story, each justification. I began to realize that Gerald's genius had always been plausible vagueness. He could speak for hours without saying anything, confess without revealing, apologize without remorse. The house began to mirror us. The ceiling light in the hallway flickered, and he never fixed it. A window hinge rusted shut. The clock above the mantel stopped at 2:17 one afternoon, and neither of us wound it again. Our home was slowly surrendering to entropy, and I think part of me welcomed it. There was an honesty in deterioration that we had long since abandoned. I started sleeping later, leaving the bed unmade because I liked the way the sheets held the shape of my solitude. I drank my coffee on the balcony, the one spot where the air still felt new, watching the same couple jog past each morning, their rhythm perfect, their breaths aligned, and I envied them, not for their youth but for their synchronization. that rare grace of moving through life at the same speed. It was around this time that the dreams began. Not nightmares exactly, but long, winding recollections of places I hadn't visited in decades. The bus station where I first met Gerald, the bakery from our honeymoon town, the small rented flat where we'd painted the walls yellow because we couldn't afford proper lighting. In the dreams, those places were always empty, preserved like exhibits after closing hours, and I wandered through them calling his name, though I knew he wouldn't answer. I'd wake with a tightness in my chest, unsure whether it was grief or relief. The mornings grew heavier, yet sharper, too. I started hearing the ticking of the world again, the kettle's slow boil, the sigh of the fridge, the whisper of my own breath, and it was almost unbearable in its intimacy. Our children called sometimes. Emily from Chicago, busy and polite, asking if her father was still keeping busy, and Mark from Phoenix, his voice half static, offering the usual weather updates, the careful deflection of sons who fear emotional questions. Neither asked how I was. It struck me that in our family, women were the connective tissue until they thinned, and then the body simply learned to limp. I didn't tell them about the ring, or the book, or the way their father's laughter had changed key, becoming something shorter, more metallic. They would only have said, "You two have been together so long, you'll work it out," as though time were a bandage that could heal anything if you just pressed hard enough. One evening, I came across him standing at the kitchen counter, staring at his hand as if trying to remember something. The indentation where the ring had rested for 40 years was still faintly visible, a pale groove of habit, and I watched as he rubbed it absently with his thumb, like a man tracing a memory he wished would fade. "Does it bother you?" I asked quietly. He didn't turn around. "What? The mark?" He shrugged. "It'll go away eventually." "Everything does," I said, and the words slipped out before I could stop them. He looked at me then, startled, as if he'd forgotten I was capable of speaking in complete thoughts. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window watching the streetlights bleed into the fog. Somewhere, a car alarm cried and stopped. I thought of how many nights I had lain beside him, listening to his breathing, measuring my peace by its rhythm, and I felt a strange sense of dislocation, as though I were remembering someone else's life. I realized, with a quiet jolt, that I had spent most of my years translating his silences, finding meaning where there was only absence, and that this exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of constant interpretation, was not love, but survival. It was near dawn when I decided to leave the house, not permanently, not yet, but long enough to remember what it felt like to move without permission. I walked to the park, the sky just beginning to tint pink at the edges, and found myself breathing in a rhythm that belonged entirely to me. I sat on a bench and opened my notebook, the one where I'd started jotting stray memories. I wrote about the sound of his whistle, about the smell of his aftershave when we were young, about how the first time he kissed me, he tasted like rain and gum and a dare. And then I wrote about the ring, about the quiet horror of recognizing that something sacred had become refuse. The words came easily, almost joyfully, as if they'd been waiting all these years for air. When I returned home, he was still asleep. His mouth was open slightly, his face unguarded, and for a fleeting instant, I saw the man I had once loved, the man who used to press his forehead to mine and whisper, "We're lucky, you know." I wanted to touch him, to trace the line of his jaw the way I used to, but my hand hovered and then fell away. love requires a listener, and mine was no longer in the room. Days turned into a strange kind of rehearsal. I cooked smaller portions, stopped ironing his shirts, left the mail unopened on the counter. He didn't comment. The absence of complaint was its own answer. I began walking further each afternoon, exploring neighborhoods I'd never bothered to see. There was a bakery 2 streets over that sold day-old croissants for half price. The woman behind the counter had hair the color of pewter and a laugh that startled birds. She called me sweetheart without irony, and the first time I heard it, I almost cried. I started bringing her wildflowers from the park in exchange for pastries she refused to charge me for. Small kindnesses, unexpected and sincere, began to fill the cracks in my days. But at home, the tension thickened. Gerald's quiet had changed texture. It was no longer indifference, but irritation. He disliked my walks, my notebook, the scent of the new lavender soap I'd bought. "You're making the place smell like a funeral," he said once, and I wondered if that was his subconscious confessing. The next morning, he snapped at me for moving his slippers. I hadn't. By evening, he apologized in that offhand way of his, a pat on the shoulder, a muttered, "Didn't mean it." But I could feel something gathering between us, an invisible static that made every shared breath an effort. One night, after another wordless dinner, I went to the study. He wasn't there. The lamp was still on, its cone of light illuminating a small stack of papers. I knew better than to look, but curiosity has its own momentum. There were letters, half-written, folded, some signed with names I didn't recognize. One caught my eye because it began with "dearest," a word he hadn't used with me since the 80s. My first instinct wasn't fury or jealousy, but a kind of sorrowful clarity. Whatever this was, it had already happened long before any woman's name entered the equation. The betrayal wasn't of fidelity, but of attention. I left the letters where they were and returned to the kitchen. The clock still read 2:17. I laughed then, quietly, at the precision of the universe's metaphors. Time had stopped, and we had simply learned to live inside the pause. I poured myself a glass of water and stood at the sink, tracing the rim with my fingertip. And it struck me that the longer we waited to speak, the heavier silence became, like air thickened with humidity until even breathing required effort. The next morning, as I tied my shoes for another walk, he asked, "Going somewhere?" His voice was casual, but the question carried a tremor. I looked up and met his eyes. "Just out," I said. "I like the quiet." He frowned. "You've been quiet enough." And for the first time in years, I smiled. Not cruelly, but with the calm certainty of a woman who knows she has already crossed the threshold of fear. I walked until the city tilted into afternoon, until my legs ached and my breath came easy. Somewhere between the bakery and the park, I realized that the world hadn't shrunk with age as I'd feared. I had simply stopped inhabiting it. The sky was larger than I remembered, the light kinder. When I came home, I found Gerald sitting at the table, his hand resting on the folded newspaper, the indentation on his finger nearly gone. He didn't look up when I entered. I passed behind him, poured myself a glass of water, and said, "You were right." He turned slightly, puzzled. "About what?" "The mark," I said. "It goes away." He didn't answer, but I saw his shoulders stiffen, and I knew then that the ring's absence had changed everything between us, not through anger or drama, but through the slow erosion of what we had pretended still existed. The first escalation, the quiet undoing, had already begun, and there was no turning back to the softness we once mistook for love. I did not announce the change with speeches or ultimatums or an inventory of wrongs that could be cross-examined and dismissed. The shift arrived the way weather turns on a patient coastline, first in the smell of the air, and then in the pressure at the temples, and finally in the clean, surprising rain. So that one Tuesday, I set 2 mugs on the counter and put only one to use. And when Gerald wandered in, looking for the second, I said lightly that I'd already had mine on the balcony and that I preferred to keep the morning to myself, and that tiny sentence, so harmless on its face, felt like a door I had been oiling for months, finally swinging on its tired hinge. After he left for his walk, I took out my sewing box, not because anything needed mending, but because I wanted the feel of a decisive tool in my hand, and with those small, sharp embroidery scissors, the same ones I used to cut our children's costume threads before school plays. I snipped the ring of my own marriage from the chain where I had worn it on difficult days when my fingers swelled, placed it beside his in the velvet box, and closed the lid with a quiet click that sounded nothing like grief and everything like a ledger balancing at last. And then I dressed in the navy skirt he always said. Made me look too formal for a Wednesday, and the cardigan he called serious. And I walked to the community center with a posture my mother would have recognized, neither apologetic nor proud, simply upright in the old-fashioned way that says, a woman is responsible for her own breath. The flyer had been on the corkboard for months. The memoir circle, Wednesday mornings, modest fee, tea provided by volunteers, and I had always passed it with that gentle condescension we reserve for goods we consider too sweet, imagining a room full of anecdotes and the worried laughter of women who needed permission to feel. Yet when I pushed open the door and smelled the thin steam of black tea and photocopied paper and pencil shavings and rain on coats, I felt a clarity I had not known in years, a sensation like a window raised in a stale house, and I took a seat by the wall as if I were saving a place for a braver version of myself who might arrive late but would surely arrive. And when the facilitator, a woman in horn rims with the unassuming grace of someone who has survived several kinds of loss, invited us to begin with a small scene rather than a thesis, I wrote, without pausing, about the banana peel and the crossword and the napkin and the ring, and I did not embroider or accuse or make a plea for understanding. I set the facts down like stones across a stream, and when I was done, my hands were trembling, not with fear, but with the novelty of carrying my own weight. When it came time to read aloud, the first 3 women offered stories I could have predicted, retirements that felt like disappearances, adult children who couldn't be bothered with birthdays, a widowhood that turned out to be a strange and guilty relief. And then it was my turn, and I heard my voice leave my mouth with the steadiness of a practiced healer's hand, not a patient's. And when I reached the sentence about him calling marriage our job, and me realizing that longevity is not love, someone at the end of the table made a small sound, not pity, not outrage, but recognition. The human hum that says I have walked near that door too, and I looked up and met the eyes of a woman with silver hair, pulled back in an elastic and a sweater the color of moss, and I saw in her expression something that might have been the opposite of loneliness. And although no one applauded, in this room we do not clap for pain, I felt, for the first time in months, the solid floor of my own life under my feet. After the session, she came to me with a square of lemon loaf wrapped in napkin and said, "I'm Lorraine. I take the notes when our leader forgets her glasses." And then, with an economical half-smile that was not invitation so much as acknowledgement, You reminded me to stop rounding down my days." And we stood for a moment in that gentle, unglamorous corridor where bulletin boards shed thumbtacks and radiators hiss and the world outside keeps insisting on errands. And I understood that this, two women exchanging an honest sentence without performance, was the kind of rescue I had been thirsting for, without the language to request it. I walked home slowly, not to prolong anything, but to notice it. And on the way, I bought 3 pears that smelled like September even though the calendar insisted on March, and I put them in a white bowl on the table where the stopped clock watched with its blank face. And when Gerald asked at dinner why there were pears when pears had never been his favorite, I said that they were for me, and that I planned to poach them in wine on Friday if they lasted that long. And the look that crossed his face was not anger or confusion, but a fleeting displacement, as if he were a guest who had walked into the wrong house and was too polite to say so. The next morning, I carried a bag of clothes to the thrift shop. Nothing dramatic. No wedding dress on a bonfire. No cinematic shedding of identity. But skirts that fit a body I no longer lived in, and sweaters I had learned to wear, because they pleased the room more than they pleased me. And with the few dollars I received, I went next door to the consignment store and bought a second-hand wool coat the color of dry ocean, with deep, unembarrassed pockets. And when I put it on, I felt neither younger nor older, but properly sized for my days. And I walked the long way home so the sleeves could learn my arms. In the afternoons, I began forgetting to switch the television to the news for him and let the room be quiet. And in that quiet, I heard again the small music of tasks done without commentary, the brush against the sink, the soft thud of mail through the slot, the secretive sigh of bread when it meets a knife. And I realized how much I had missed the companionship of my own attention, how long I had loaned it to another person's comfort, and I did not resent him for taking what I offered so generously, but neither did I offer it any more without considering what was left for me. When the Memoir Circle asked us to undertake a modest risk before the next meeting, something that would signal to ourselves, more than to anyone else, that we were willing to act on the stories we were writing, I chose an errand that would seem trivial to someone who has not lived inside a long marriage. And yet, for me, it felt like stepping onto a different platform at the same station. I went to the bank alone and asked the young teller with the stud in her eyebrow to open a small account in my name only, funded with the money that had accumulated from the little economies of a woman who learned to make soup from bones and to sew the knees of her children's jeans twice before buying new. And when she slid the temporary card across the counter and said, "You'll get the real one in the mail," I did not think of secrecy or escape. I thought of how good it felt to possess a modest lever that could move my own life a few inches at a time, and I walked out into the wind with my coat unbuttoned, just to feel its argument with my blouse. At home, Gerald asked if I could pick up his dry cleaning the next day, because the suit he favored for funerals had developed a sheen at the elbows, and I said, "I'll be at the center on Wednesdays from now on. You'll need to handle it." And he blinked and then nodded, as if I had spoken in code he almost understood, and I saw, with a tenderness untainted by nostalgia, that he had always been at his best when given a list, and at his worst when asked for a feeling. And I felt suddenly free of the project of re-engineering a man who was built for clarity of task rather than depth of regard. That evening, I cooked for one on purpose and set his portion in the fridge with a note about reheating times, not to punish or dramatize, but to calibrate. And then I took my bowl to the balcony and ate with my feet in wool socks and my coat on against the stubborn spring. And when a boy below me laughed that uncluttered laugh of children who have not yet been told the price of staying, I laughed too, not at him, but with the world for presenting itself unasked. I started putting small things in order that had nothing to do with him, renewing my library card, oiling the front door, laundering the quilt my mother stitched by lamplight, backing up my few photographs to a cloud my grandson once taught me to use. And each act felt like dusting a shelf in a long locked room, a ritual more sacred than the heavy gestures popular with people who prefer grand narrative sweeps. And when I opened the velvet box before bed, not to torture myself, but to check whether my resolve was a mood or a muscle, I saw the two rings side by side, like coins from a country that had quietly devalued its currency. And I understood, without bitterness, that symbols are tools and tools belong to the hand that uses them, and my hands had different work to do now. I did not tell anyone, not the children, who would take sides they did not understand, not the friends who would gift me articles about forgiveness and neurotransmitters and the sociology of long-time partnerships, not even Lorraine, whose listening felt like a chair I could sink into. I simply kept moving through my days with a new arithmetic, subtracting what drained and adding what steadied, and in that unshowy math, I discovered that the midpoint of a life is not measured by age but by whether you begin to act as if your breath belongs to you. And one night, when the stopped clock still said 2:17 and the moon made a coin of light on the velvet lid, I whispered into the good dark a sentence that was not a prayer and not a vow, but something practical, the way a woman might speak to herself before lifting a heavy pot. I can carry me. The change, once it started, did not stop politely at the edges of my schedule. It began to spill over like water that refuses to obey a vessel, and the life that had fit so neatly into routine began to warp in subtle, unavoidable ways. Gerald noticed first not through any grand revelation, but through the unease of disrupted predictability. He would come into the kitchen and find that I was already dressed to leave before he had finished his coffee, or that the radio he liked to hum along with during breakfast had been turned off, replaced by the sound of pen against paper. I could sense his confusion gathering in the corners of the house, not as anger, but as bewilderment, the astonishment of a man who has suddenly discovered that the furniture rearranges itself while he sleeps. For the first time in years, he began asking questions that were not logistical. "What are you writing all the time?" he asked one evening, leaning on the doorframe with the mild impatience of someone accustomed to answers. "Just notes," I said, not lifting my eyes. "About what?" "About the weather," I replied, though we both knew it hadn't rained in days. He nodded slowly, smiled without conviction, and left the room. And I felt an almost maternal pity for him, because he didn't yet understand that curiosity arrives too late when it follows neglect. By then, the memoir group had become an anchor I didn't know I'd needed. Each Wednesday morning, I walked there through air that still smelled of bakery yeast and bus exhaust, carrying my notebook like an organ I had recently learned was vital. Lorraine always saved me a seat near the window, and we would exchange those quiet smiles that mean, "I see you surviving." One day, she read a passage about her husband's death, and how the silence afterward had first terrified her and then begun to sound like music, and I realized that grief and awakening sometimes hum in the same key. When the meeting ended, she slipped a folded note into my palm, her phone number, nothing else, and said, "Call if the night gets too long." I didn't call that night, but I kept the paper in my wallet, and knowing it was there was like keeping a small lamp lit behind my ribs. At home, Gerald's small irritations began to sharpen into barbs. He commented on my new coat, called it extravagant, asked whether I'd suddenly won the lottery. He complained that I'd forgotten to pick up his dry cleaning, though I had reminded him twice that the errand was now his. One evening, he knocked on the bathroom door while I was brushing my hair and said, "You're out an awful lot these days. Should I be jealous?" The question might have been playful if not for the edge beneath it. I caught his reflection in the mirror. The same man, the same thinning hair, the same slope of nose. But something behind the eyes had hardened, a flicker of hostility that startled me. "Jealous of what?" I asked. "You tell me," he said, and then laughed, the kind of laugh that is really a test. I did not answer. I finished brushing my hair, turned off the light, and walked past him without touching his arm. I heard him mutter something under his breath, perhaps my name, perhaps a curse, but I didn't turn back. The air between us thickened. The small domestic exchanges that once masked the void now became skirmishes fought with teaspoons and calendars. He began moving things I'd left out, folding my half-read newspaper, turning down the volume of my radio when I left the room. It was as if he was trying to restore a vanished order by rearranging the evidence of my autonomy. One night, he stood behind me as I wrote at the kitchen table and said, "You used to tell me what you were thinking." I looked up, met his eyes, and said evenly, "You used to want to know." The silence that followed was the longest we had ever shared, and it was not empty. It was dense with everything that had been unsaid over the years, heavy as wet wool. Our daughter called that weekend, cheerful and hurried as always. "Dad says you're busy with some writing thing," she said. "That's great, Mom. Keeping the mind sharp." I smiled at the irony that she could hear pride in his voice where I had only heard resentment. "It helps me remember," I told her. "Remember what?" she asked, distracted. And when I said myself, she laughed lightly and said she had to go. After we hung up, I realized that invisibility does not announce itself. It accumulates by degrees until even your children's affection begins to glance off you like light on fog. Then came the night of the dinner party, the event that would become, though I didn't know it then, the true fulcrum of our unraveling. We had been invited by old friends, couples we had known since our children were in school, and I hesitated, but Gerald insisted. "It'll be good to see people," he said. "You've been so wrapped up in your writing." He said the word as though it were a minor illness. So I agreed, partly to prove to myself that I could still inhabit our shared life without suffocating. I wore a dress I hadn't touched in years, navy silk with a faint shimmer at the hem, and when I walked into the living room, he looked at me for a long time before saying, "That's a bit much for Linda's pot roast, isn't it?" I told him that after 40 years I was entitled to look like myself, at least once in public. At the dinner table, the talk was the usual collage of retirements, grandchildren, and property taxes. Gerald dominated the conversation, telling old stories of our travels, polishing them until they gleamed with self-congratulation. I sat beside him, nodding, smiling when expected, feeling like a ghost who had wandered into her own past. Then Linda asked, "So what have you been up to, Maribel? You're always so quiet." Gerald answered before I could speak. "Oh, she's taken up writing," he said, the corners of his mouth twitching in that practiced smirk that signals gentle mockery. "Memoirs, I think. The great domestic saga." The table erupted in polite laughter. I felt the heat rise in my chest but kept my voice calm. Yes, I said. It's about honesty. Careful, he said, still smiling. You might end up writing me as the villain. Wouldn't that be an improvement? I asked, still smiling too, but my eyes did not. The laughter died quickly. The rest of the meal unfolded under a fragile civility that could have cracked under a whisper. When we returned home, he went straight to his study without a word, and I stood in the hallway listening to the door click shut, the sound sharp as a final punctuation mark. The next morning, he didn't speak to me at all. His silence had texture now, deliberate and punitive. He moved through the rooms as though performing a ritual of erasure, leaving behind faint traces of aftershave and resentment. I found myself tiptoeing, not out of fear, but out of a perverse courtesy, unwilling to disturb his campaign. When I returned from the memoir group that week, I found my notebook missing from the table. I searched everywhere, beneath cushions, in drawers, on shelves, but it was gone. My heart pounded with the slow, methodical panic of someone whose voice has been stolen. I confronted him in his study. He was reading the paper, glasses perched low. "Where is it?" I asked. He didn't look up. "Where's what?" "My notebook." He turned a page leisurely. "Maybe you left it at your club." "It's not a club," I said, my voice rising despite myself. "Where is it, Gerald?" Finally, he met my eyes. "I read it," he said simply. The words struck like cold water. "You had no right." "I had every right," he replied. "You were writing about me." "I was writing about my life," I said. "I'm part of your life," he countered. "You've been dissecting me for strangers." "They're not strangers," I said, though of course they were. "You had no right," I repeated, and he shrugged. "Maybe not. But now I know what you really think." He stood then, folded the paper, and walked past me. I followed him into the kitchen, where he opened the back door and tossed the notebook into the garbage bin, as casually as if discarding a receipt. I heard the faint thud of paper against plastic. Something in me broke with that sound. Not a dramatic shatter, but the internal snapping of a final thread. "You shouldn't have done that," I said, almost whispering. "You shouldn't have written it," he said, and left the room. I waited until he went to bed, then slipped outside barefoot, retrieved the notebook, and found that the pages were smudged but mostly intact. I laid them out on the balcony to dry under the moonlight, the ink shimmering faintly like veins in a leaf, and as I watched them flutter, I realized that he could destroy objects, but not the part of me that had already begun to live beyond his reach. After that night, the house became a battlefield, disguised as civility. We stopped sharing meals entirely. He did his own shopping. I cooked for myself. The phone calls from the children became our only common ground, brief truces performed for their benefit. When they visited for Easter, we played the roles of affectionate elders so convincingly that even I almost believed it. But the moment they left, the air reverted to its usual tension, thick and metallic. One afternoon, while cleaning the kitchen, I found a letter on the counter in an unfamiliar handwriting. It was unsigned, folded once, and addressed simply to G. The words were brief, too brief to be anything but intimate. "Thinking of you today. Same place next week." I read it twice, not in shock but in weary recognition. It confirmed what I had already known, that the emotional exodus had begun long before I noticed. I placed the letter back exactly as I'd found it, because confrontation would have given it the dignity of surprise, and I was long past surprise. That evening, I attended Lorraine's poetry reading at the library. She read a piece about reclaiming silence, about how sometimes the most radical act a woman can commit is to stop explaining herself. I sat in the back, my coat draped over my lap, and felt her words move through me like electricity, awakening muscles I hadn't used since girlhood. Afterward, we walked together to the bus stop. She asked how things were at home, and for the first time I answered without euphemism. "He read my notebook," I said. She stopped walking, turned to me, and said, "Then it's time to stop living in the same paragraph." The sentence landed in me like a diagnosis. That night, lying in bed beside Gerald's slow, even breathing, I stared at the ceiling and planned my next move with a calmness that startled me. There would be no shouting, no confrontation. Just a series of deliberate acts, quiet and irreversible. I rose before dawn, went to the desk, and began rewriting the lost pages from memory, this time sharper, clearer, less forgiving. I titled the section, "The Disappearing Act." By the time he woke, the sun had painted a pale stripe across the floor, and I had already written the final sentence. He mistook my quiet for absence, but I was only gathering strength. In the following days, I began closing accounts, not the secret one I'd opened, but the invisible ones, the favors, the caretaking, the emotional bookkeeping. When he asked where I was going, I answered, "Out." When he asked what was for dinner, I said, "Whatever you make." The first few times he looked at me as if I'd spoken nonsense. Then he stopped asking. The rhythm of our life flattened into two separate frequencies. I did not mourn. I simply exhaled. The real confrontation came not in words, but in a moment of stillness. He found me on the balcony one afternoon, reading through my dried pages. "Are you planning to publish that?" he asked. "Maybe," I said. "Would you use our real names?" "Does it matter?" I asked. He looked at me for a long time, then said quietly, "You've changed." "No," I said. "I stopped changing for you." He nodded once, not in agreement, but in recognition of defeat, and walked back inside. That night, for the first time in our marriage, he slept in the guest room. The sound of the door closing was softer than a sigh, yet it reverberated through every layer of my body. I lay awake listening to the emptiness between our walls, and it did not sound like loss. It sounded like space. Room enough for breath, for thought, for a future not yet decided but already belonging to me. The escalation had completed its circle. I was no longer a woman waiting for permission to leave. I was a woman who had already stepped beyond the threshold, even if my feet were still inside the house. It was late May when the decision finally ceased to be theoretical, when the quiet rehearsals of leaving gave way to the choreography of action. And though I had imagined the moment many times, in the kitchen, with the light slanting just so, or on the balcony where the breeze always made courage seem almost natural, it came instead on an ordinary Monday that carried no omen, only a stillness so complete it felt like an invitation. Gerald had gone out for his walk, that same route he had kept to for years, his head bent in the slightly arrogant posture of a man who believes the world owes him courtesy. I waited until the sound of the door latch settled into the air, and then I moved through the rooms with a clarity that was neither panic nor triumph, but something calmer, an instinct like tidying up after a long illness. I opened drawers and removed what was mine, not the gifts, not the shared purchases, but the things that bore the imprint of my touch alone. My mother's silver thimble, a locket with no photograph, a handful of recipe cards yellowed at the corners, the notebook whose pages he had once tried to erase. Each object went into a small suitcase that I had borrowed from Lorraine under the pretext of a weekend trip. She had pressed it into my hands without question, only saying, "Make sure it's not heavier coming back." The bank transfer took less than 5 minutes. The lawyer, a woman younger than my daughter, had already prepared the documents weeks earlier. She had a quiet professionalism that comforted me. "You've made up your mind," she said, not as a question, but as a verification. "I have," I replied. "Then you're already halfway free," she said. I signed where she pointed, my hand steady, my heart unexpectedly light. The house, long paid off, was in my name, a small accident of paperwork from the early years when Gerald had been between jobs and I was the one with stable employment. He had never bothered to correct it. He'd joked once that a man didn't need his name on every wall to feel at home. I remembered that joke now and almost smiled at its irony. The sale had been arranged quietly, the buyer a widower from another town who preferred simplicity and quick closings. By the time the papers were finalized, the only thing left to do was tell Gerald, though even that felt like an unnecessary courtesy. When he returned that afternoon, flushed from the sun, he found me in the living room packing the last of my books into a box. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice attempting lightness but failing. "Yes," I said. "We both are." He frowned, stepping closer. "What's that supposed to mean?" I turned to face him fully. "It means the house has been sold. You'll have a few weeks to find somewhere else. I've already arranged the transfer." His mouth opened slightly, a soundless protest forming in the space between disbelief and insult. "You did what?" he said finally, and there was that flicker of anger I had once mistaken for passion. "You can't just—" "I can," I interrupted, and for the first time in years, my voice did not tremble. "It's mine, legally, and morally, I think I've earned it." He stared at me as though trying to locate the woman he used to command with a sigh, but she was no longer in the room. "You're out of your mind," he said. "We've lived here 40 years. And I've lived inside your silence for just as long," I answered. He sank into the armchair, his hands gripping the fabric, and for a moment I saw not my husband, but an aging man realizing too late that the ground beneath him had shifted. "So that's it?" he said finally. "After everything?" "After everything," I replied, and the words, instead of sounding bitter, came out like a benediction. There was no need for shouting. The years had already done all the shouting for us. He asked where I would go, and I told him. A small apartment near the library, a place with morning light, and a balcony wide enough for a chair and a pot of herbs. "You'll hate it," he said automatically. "It's too small." "It's the right size for one," I said. The next day, I packed the rest in silence. I moved through the house without nostalgia, only a faint ache of recognition, the way one might feel walking through a museum of personal artifacts. I paused at the dining table where we had hosted birthdays, the kitchen window where the light always fell on his shoulders, the hallway where our children's growth marks were still faintly visible on the doorframe. But even as I looked, I felt no pull to stay. Memory is not a chain, only a shadow, and I had already stepped out of its reach. I left the velvet box on the counter, both rings inside, a note folded neatly on top. "You threw it away first." Nothing more. I didn't need to sign my name. He would recognize my handwriting. Lorraine came with her car at noon, and together we loaded the boxes. She didn't ask questions. She just opened the passenger door and waited. As we drove away, the house receded in the rearview mirror, a neat rectangle of brick and history. I thought I might feel the sharp sting of loss, but instead there was a curious lightness, as though I had shed an extra layer of skin. At a stoplight, Lorraine reached over and squeezed my hand. "You okay?" she asked. "I'm breathing," I said. "That's a start." The first night in my new apartment was strangely silent. The refrigerator hummed like a polite stranger, and the pipes groaned with their own unfamiliar rhythm. I sat on the floor among boxes, eating pears from the bowl I had carried with me, and felt the first real hunger I'd experienced in years, not for food, but for existence. I slept with the windows open and woke at dawn to the sound of birds and distant traffic. When I brewed coffee, the smell filled the room completely, unshared, unmoderated. For once, the world seemed sized exactly to my measure. He called 2 days later. The phone rang and rang before I answered, letting each tone settle like a test of will. "Maribel," he said, his voice stripped of its usual armor. "We need to talk." "About what?" I asked. "About what happens next." "What happens next," I said slowly, "is whatever you choose. I've already chosen mine." "You can't just erase me," he said. "You're part of me." "No," I replied. "I was a story you told yourself about stability. But stories end." There was a long pause. I could hear his breathing, ragged, uncertain. "Are you happy now?" he asked finally. "Not yet," I said, "but I'm closer." After I hung up, I went to the balcony and looked down at the street, where an old man was teaching his granddaughter how to ride a bicycle. She wobbled, nearly fell, and then steadied herself, laughing. The grandfather clapped softly, proud but cautious, ready to catch her if she faltered. I watched until they disappeared around the corner, the laughter echoing like a small bell in the air. It struck me that freedom, like balance, comes not from perfection, but from motion, from the willingness to lean forward even when you don't know if you'll fall. In the weeks that followed, I built a rhythm. Mornings at the library, afternoons writing at the cafe near the park, evenings with Lorraine or alone on my balcony, a book in my lap. I wrote not about him anymore, but about women like me, women who had mistaken endurance for devotion, patience for virtue, silence for peace. My memoir circle became my congregation, the table our altar, the pages our confessions. When it came time to share my new piece, I read it without hesitation. It ended with a simple line. "Sometimes leaving is the most faithful act a woman can perform." There was no applause, only the hum of breath and the soft clink of cups, and I felt something settle inside me, a stillness that was not emptiness, but completion. One afternoon, as I returned from the cafe, I found an envelope slipped under my door. Inside was the velvet box. He must have driven across town to deliver it himself. The note read only, "You were right. I didn't drop it. I couldn't wear it anymore because I couldn't feel you in it." I sat on the floor with the box open beside me, the rings gleaming under the late sun, and for the first time in months, I cried. Not out of sadness, but out of release. I didn't call him. I didn't write back. I simply placed the box in a drawer and let it rest there, like an artifact from a completed chapter. A few days later, I went to the sea with Lorraine. The drive was long, the air heavy with salt. We walked along the shore until the tide reached our shoes, and she handed me a small stone. "For letting go," she said. I nodded, closed my eyes, and threw it into the water. It made a tiny splash, quickly erased by waves. We stood there a long time, our coats whipping in the wind, two women who had outlasted apology. When we returned, I rearranged my apartment. I moved the writing desk near the window so I could see the park below. I placed the bowl of pears on the table, though they were nearly overripe now, and opened my notebook to a blank page. The first words came easily, as if they had been waiting. I thought freedom would be loud, but it is the quiet that saves me. That evening, as the city lights flickered on, I made myself a small dinner and poured a glass of wine. I toasted nothing in particular, just the air, the quiet, the ordinary. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed and faded. I looked around the room, at its bare simplicity, at the suitcase now tucked neatly under the bed, and felt the unmistakable pulse of life continuing. The climax of my story, I realized, was not in the leaving itself, but in the steadiness that followed, the refusal to collapse into regret or triumph. It was in the recognition that what I had done was neither rebellion nor escape, but a return to proportion, a rebalancing of the soul's arithmetic. When I finally turned out the light that night, I whispered the only prayer I still believed in. Thank you for ending when I was still strong enough to begin again. The years since that day have not been dramatic. They have been patient, slow in their mercy, like soil rebuilding itself after too many seasons of drought. I live now in a rhythm that fits the body I have become. Morning tea on the balcony, the scent of jasmine rising from the pots I coaxed back to life. A notebook always open, though I no longer feel the urgency to fill it. The silence that once frightened me has turned into a companion of deep intelligence. It asks nothing, demands no explanation, and yet it answers everything with the quiet precision of truth. People assume that freedom feels like exhilaration, but I have found that it feels instead like balance, like a door that finally closes without protest. The world outside my window has changed little. Children still chase each other in the park. Buses still sigh at the corner stop. But I have learned that renewal does not require novelty. It requires attention. Some days I still wake startled, expecting the weight of a second breath beside mine, the faint snore, the warmth that once promised safety. Then I remember that what I mistook for safety was repetition, and that repetition, unexamined, is a kind of burial. I rise, make coffee, and step into the morning as if stepping into a life that keeps forgiving me for taking so long to arrive. I have not seen Gerald in almost 3 years. Once, last winter, I spotted him across the market square, older and thinner, holding a small bag of oranges. He saw me, I think. There was a flicker of recognition, then a polite nod, the kind one gives to a former colleague at a train station. We did not approach each other. There was nothing cruel in our distance, only a quiet acknowledgement that some stories complete themselves when words are no longer necessary. That night, I went home, and for the first time since leaving, opened the drawer where I had placed the velvet box. I looked at the rings, dull now, their shine subdued by time and air, and I understood that even metal forgets its former purpose if given enough rest. I did not cry. I simply closed the box and returned it to the drawer, where it remains, less a relic than a punctuation mark. Lorraine still visits most Fridays. We sit on the balcony with a pot of mint tea, reading each other's sentences aloud. Her hair has turned completely white. Mine, silver with streaks of defiance. We joke that between the two of us we possess the whole weather system of wisdom. Sometimes she brings pastries from the bakery, sometimes small clippings for my plants. Our friendship has become a kind of monastery of gentleness. No demands, no performances, only the shared knowledge that we survived the narrowing of our own lives. She tells me about her grandchildren. I tell her about the essays I've started publishing in the local journal. They are not about Gerald, not directly, though his shadow lengthens quietly across each page. They are about women learning to occupy the full volume of their own lives, about the subtle forms of hunger that marriage can teach, and the delicate, almost invisible courage it takes to feed oneself again. The memoir circle continues too, though we meet now in a small cafe instead of the drafty community room. We call ourselves, half-jokingly, the Department of Second Chances. Some of the original women have moved away, others have joined, younger and quicker to laugh, and I find myself in the unexpected role of elder, the one who listens before speaking. When new members confess the tremor of their first written truth, I tell them gently that courage is not a flame but a pilot light. It only needs oxygen. They often smile, sometimes cry. In their faces, I see my own former self, the woman who waited too long for permission. And I want to tell her that forgiveness begins when you stop asking to be seen and start looking outward with unborrowed eyes. Every so often, I receive a letter from Emily or Mark, short updates about work, children, the predictable logistics of middle life. They still speak of their father with a certain distance, as though describing a landscape they've learned to pass through without lingering. They visit me in the summer. We eat pears on the balcony, their skins bruising under our fingers, and they tell me that I seem lighter. I tell them that I am not lighter, but less divided. Emily once asked if I ever regretted the divorce, the way people ask if you regret surviving a storm, because the aftermath is inconvenient. I told her that regret is a word for people who believe time can be rewritten. I prefer to think of it as compost. What was painful has turned fertile. I have made small rituals of endurance. On Sundays, I walk to the sea, not far by bus, and sit on the bench near the pier where gulls argue over crumbs. I bring my notebook, but rarely write. I simply watch the tide. The sea has taught me everything I needed to know about persistence, that it is possible to keep arriving and departing in the same gesture, that boundaries can hold and yield at once, that return is not the same as retreat. Sometimes I take off my shoes and step into the water until the cold climbs my calves, and in those moments I feel every year of my life folded into the salt, every wound rinsed and made ordinary. I think of the stone I threw with Lorraine that day, how small its sound was against the vastness, and how perfectly that smallness described the proportion of human heartbreak in the scale of the world. There are still nights when the old patterns knock at the door of my mind, the urge to explain, to justify, to imagine how things might have been if either of us had spoken earlier, softer, truer. But I have learned to let those ghosts pass through without setting the table for them. I tell them in silence that they are welcome to visit but not to stay. I sleep well most nights, sometimes even dream of beginnings instead of endings. In one recurring dream, I am in the park again, not as the observer but as the girl on the bicycle, steadying herself before the first turn. There is no grandfather clapping, no one watching, just the wind against my face and the simple, terrifying knowledge that balance is a private ceremony. The apartment has aged with me, paint peeling slightly near the window, bookshelves crowded with both stories and air. I have kept the velvet box in its drawer, the coat in its place by the door, and the habit of writing letters I never send. I know now that not everything needs an audience. Some truths exist only to anchor the self. when I catch my reflection in the glass, I see not the widow or the abandoned or the survivor, but a woman shaped by her own verbs: left, built, wrote, lived. And that recognition, quiet and sufficient, is what I once mistook for love in another's eyes. Sometimes, in the late afternoon, I imagine another woman somewhere, perhaps younger, perhaps not, standing in her own kitchen, holding a discovery that unthreads her certainties. A ring in the trash, a sentence half heard, a silence too loud to bear. I want to tell her that she is not crazy, not selfish, not ungrateful for expecting tenderness to last. I want to tell her that every ending begins with the refusal to disappear. And if she listens carefully, she might hear my voice carried faintly through the years, saying what I wish someone had said to me. You are not here to be quiet inside someone else's comfort. You are here to become the sound of your own life taking shape. And when dusk settles and the first star appears above the park, I close my notebook and sit in the fading light, the city softening into evening. The ring, the house, the years, all of it seems impossibly distant, like the shoreline viewed from a departing ferry. I am not bitter. I am not triumphant. I am simply present, which is rarer than either. I pour myself a small cup of wine, raise it to the air, and whisper to the unseen women who might need the echo. We are still here, and the quiet belongs to us now.